Hello and a very warm welcome to Building Africa's Prosperity. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, following a myriad of calls from across all economic sectors to revive the South African economy, a plethora of conferences and summits have been held to show urgency on the matter. What's actually going to be done? What can we do? That's what we're looking at today's show. We tackle the topic of infrastructure development and project finance here in South Africa. I'm joined by Mphokolo Makara, Transactor in infrastructure finance at RMB, and Mpho Mokwele, the head of project finance at DBSA. Thank you very much for joining me. So both of you want action on this. Starting with you, Mphokolo, what do you want to be seen done yesterday?
Thanks very much for the opportunity, Chris. And I think from myself as a transactor and as a market in general, we would like to see projects come online. And that is not only projects in construction, but in terms of pipeline projects and policy projects, such as specific programs come to market such that we can bank and start executing projects which will make a difference to our energy needs, our infrastructure needs, and our transportation needs as a country to drive the growth of this country.
Now, if I come over to you, Mpho, the DBSA, as you say, there's been a myriad of calls for action. It's a very crucial time for the South African economy and also its infrastructure and electricity. What do you want to be seen done today?
Yeah, Chris, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. From my point of view, Chris, I think we really need to concentrate on implementation. I think we've been talking quite a lot, so we're in a position now where we really need to get things going and implement projects. So from a point of view of infrastructure projects, we are lacking in terms of bankable, viable projects that can be implemented. So what we really need to do is put more effort in terms of project preparation efforts, and in order to ensure that there's a robust pipeline of projects that can feed through the system on a continuous basis. I think that is quite important. And maybe lastly, Chris, we just need to make sure that all the lessons that we learned under the Renewable IPP program, all of those lessons are taken into account in terms of being adopted, leading into going forward in terms of infrastructure delivery.
We'll talk a little bit more about the lessons from the IPP project, but Mphokolo, if I go back to you, it's a different world though we're talking now. A lot more risk has to be written into projects now because of the world of COVID-19 we're going to be living with for quite some time yet.
Indeed it is, Chris. And I think the reality is, if anything, COVID has highlighted the constraints in our infrastructure system. I mean, using an example that we're probably all alive to is the recent load shedding bouts we've had, which have increased over this lockdown period. If anything, that just shows exactly what the lack of new projects coming onto the market on time and as planned, as well as what a lack of maintenance spending does in terms of maintaining current capacity. So it's both a new generation capacity coming onto stream and also just maintaining what we have to make sure that that works while we're waiting for new projects to come onto the market.
Okay, and Mpho, if I go back to you now, you mentioned the IPP project in this country, which was quite high profile. The idea was to give concessionary tariffs for those who weren't following it to independent power producers for renewable energy. The idea was to create South Africa as a hub for renewable energy. Unfortunately, the scheme took a lot longer than the people involved in it thought to pay off. There was a lot of, shall we say, dispute with the ministry at the end, and a lot of people, sadly, they left this country and went off to do projects in other countries. What do you think were the big lessons there, Mpho?
So some of the big lessons, Chris, in the Renewable IPP program is, you know, that program was quite successful. And I think that is acknowledged globally, that it is one of those model programs, the framework thereof we need to really adopt in terms of accelerating infrastructure delivery. So some of the lessons learned there is around how that program received an exemption from the PPP framework, which is regarded as quite cumbersome and complex. And by the PPP framework, I mean private-public partnership, the legislation to use to ensure that there is partnership between the private sector and the public sector. Then that program, the Renewable IPP program as well, was really implemented by a well-resourced project management office. And I think a lot of us have heard of the IPP office, which really attracted skills from both the private sector and the public sector. So that public and private partnership model really has worked well and served us well. And we really need to ensure that that collaborative effort is really enforced in order to be successful in implementing infrastructure.
Mphokolo, if we come back where we came in on this discussion, I mean, I've heard many politicians in the last 6 months, a year alone, talking about the energy crisis, which is still affecting the South African economy here, saying, oh, well, you know, renewable energy, it'll make up for the shortfall. But it's easily dismissed in a phrase, but it's a lot of hard work, it's a lot of investment. How can that be gathered, do you think, in the long term?
I think in the long term, one has to be very open-minded in terms of, as Mpho has said, what the renewable energy program was meant to achieve in terms of opening up the sector, which one would have thought that by now we are sitting in 2020. That program started in 2011, so 9 years later, one would have thought that would have brought the traction to start opening up the energy generation sector within South Africa. It is still regulated. You still do not have private sector being able to generate, trade, and distribute power into the national grid without having to go through a national transmission company and a national buyer, which is the form of Eskom, right? So I think what would be good to see would be exactly what the objective of these programs are playing out over time, as opposed to us sitting 9 years later, still in a constrained environment where private sector can't play and bring about solutions that can drive energy generation sector forward. What we have, however, seen is a lot more private sector players looking to generate own power in the form of renewables. And that is the likes of, we've seen the Sasol RFP come out, we've seen the ArcelorMittal come out, we've seen Anglo Platinum in the form of Mogalakwena come out. Having said that, those are not at financial close stage as yet, because we're all trying to navigate around a regulated energy sector. Now, when it comes to renewables, I think what's important is to realize that we need to have a just transition. As a country, we rely on coal because it's predominantly the resource that we've been endowed with. But if you look at the universe of technologies available to generate power, you've got renewables, which are clean and green in terms of what the narrative is today about generating technologies which are less carbon intensive. You've got gas, which is slightly better than coal. And then you've got coal, which for a country is predominant in our energy mix. Then you've got nuclear, that is also a different debate on its own. You've got geothermal, which is cleaner, but we don't have that as a natural resource in this country. So one needs to look at the universe and spectrum of technologies available, as well as how that fits into coming on stream on time, as well as giving the reliability in terms of ability to generate power into the grid consistently, as well as the distances that this power generated at a particular source needs to travel to get to where it's needed without necessarily it being lost in the distance of transmission and distribution infrastructure.
Mpho, I go back to you. Mphokolo mentioned there something that therein lies at the heart of the problems that we face investing for the future in infrastructure in South Africa is the fact that Eskom, the national power generator, is not only a player, it's also the referee on the pitch as well, which everyone's been talking about for years, saying it's a problem, but nothing much has changed.
I mean, Chris, just to latch on to what Mphokolo has said, the government is limited in terms of its financial capacity as we speak. So we really need the private sector to come to the fore in terms of pools of capital, pools of money available to help Eskom, to help the government really, just to increase the energy supply that we are currently short of. I mean, we've been experiencing load shedding the past couple of days in South Africa, past couple of months. So we really need to ensure that there's other initiatives that come to the fore. And self-generation, embedded generation is quite important, an important angle where the private sector can be self-generating their own power and buying the power from independent power producers. So where municipality wants to procure energy directly from an independent power producer, or where an energy intensive user, such as a mining company, wanting to procure power from that independent power producer, that enabling environment should be in place, such that we remove the burden of Eskom, we remove the burden of the government from providing government guarantees under energy programs such as the Renewable Energy IPP program.
Mphokolo, if I go back to you, I was talking to Mpho before the show. I mean, everyone talks about renewable energy, perhaps these conferences we mentioned in the intro, saying, oh, we have sunshine here, we have wind in plenty in Africa, but it's a lot more difficult than that. I was saying to Mpho before the show, there's an entrepreneur I know who set up a wind farm in the Northern Cape in DR, and when she took the paperwork in alone, she had to drive a van to carry it all. There was that much red tape to go through. Don't you think it's time to perhaps clear out a lot of this red tape?
And Chris, you're absolutely right. And we've seen it a lot in the, even in the renewables program, where one needs to get a generation license from NERSA, one needs to get a water license from the Department of Water and Sanitation, one also needs to get environmental clearances, one then also needs to deal with land clearances, whether that's through land lease agreements or servitude. And I think that is a question of regulators and the government in terms of driving efficiency and changing regulations and legislation to allow private sector involvement to be a lot more seamless. If you take it back to energy generation and where the distributed power opportunities lie, I think around 2 years ago, when Minister Jeff Radebe was still the Minister of Energy, we had a directive issued to say, please open up the sector for distributed power. We are sitting today and have not had any feedback in terms of distributed power being used to generate electricity, which can be traded across the grid. So I think it's a conversation that needs to happen at haste and with intent, because so long as we let these regulatory constraints inhibit progress, we are going to be sitting where we are now with load shedding. And I think an example was made from the CSIR earlier this year that alone in the first quarter of 2020, we sat with the highest hours of load shedding in Eskom's history.
And that's the problem. I mean, everyone struggles, everyone loses business when the electricity goes down, and it costs the country money. But Mpho, I might just give you an example. Recently I was talking to an entrepreneur a few days ago from Uganda. He got a nice foreign investment, $1.5 million into his factory. He said it took him 3 months of paperwork in Kampala to get it through. And yet, at the other end of the continent, you've got Rwanda, where you can set up a company within 24 hours. It can be done. Why can't it be done here in South Africa to streamline this whole thing, get it online and get it working?
Look, I think it can be done, Chris. It can be done. And the Infrastructure Development Act does allow for that. For certain processes, such as if you look at an environmental authorization in South Africa, will take anywhere from 18 months up to sometimes 24 months just to get through that process and get an environmental authorization. But where it comes to your Infrastructure Development Act, it allows for those processes to be truncated, that period of time in order to get licensing and permits to be sort of shortened. And because, you know, we are in a situation where it's quite urgent to get our infrastructure delivered, the infrastructure delivery to be accelerated, we need to use the acts such as the Infrastructure Delivery Act, Development Act, to help us to truncate those processes. And we're talking about an integrated resource plan of energy that is already been promulgated in 2019. What we really now need to do is really concentrate on the implementation of the projects underlying that plan. We are talking here about the risk mitigation IPP program, which we've seen on the positive side. We've seen the request for proposals come out in the market for the procurement of 2,000 megawatts under that program. Me being a transactor, I'm very excited about the fact that those requests for proposals have come out in the market, and we'll be seeing a lot of traction in the next couple of months, Chris. That is quite exciting in order to really start closing the energy supply constraints that we are all facing.
Mphokolo, you're a Transactor in Infrastructure and Finance at RMB. What are the challenges and opportunities you're seeing coming up in the task of attracting foreign capital?
I think we're very fortunate, Chris, that we're in an environment where, and not just today, historically, where a lot of the stimulus packages globally are looking for a home. Thankfully, as a country, I mean, just before COVID and before our interest rates were decreased to stimulate economic activity, we were sitting at pretty high, late or early teens interest rates, right? Where some of the developed markets are sitting at literally this low single digits. So there is appetite because everybody's looking for yield. But yield is not the only constant in determining where funds and cash flow. So things like risk become important. Things like time to get to market, to get to financial close on a transaction, as well as getting to commercial operations date becomes a lot more critical, because only do you start generating revenues from a project once you're actually commercially operating. So I think the good thing is that all of us and the world over are wanting to fast track infrastructure development. It's a common theme globally wherever you go, and there are funds. But the only problem becomes, how do you then fast track the implementation of those projects? I mean, bearing in mind that by themselves in nature, infrastructure projects are long dated in construction and are long dated through their operating period. But I think that's something some of these people have actually come to terms with. But it's about how do we then make sure that the pipeline, as Mpho has also said, is bankable and can be easily closed tomorrow to then fast track the commercial operations date. I mean, we've had the SIDS recently, the 55 projects announced. I mean, for us, the market is very grateful for those, but also the state of readiness and for us to move forward is also something that needs to be better done in terms of what do we do to fast track processes relative to fast tracking projects coming to the market.
And Mpho, just give us an idea of scale as well. I mean, we're talking like a massive, massive demand for electricity in South Africa. I mean, look at all those coal-fired power stations, most of them built in the 1970s. They're already beyond their time and they're going to be retired off. And also with the situation with using fossil fuels, they like to be retired a lot faster than we think. How huge is this market for energy here in South Africa?
I mean, the market is quite significantly, well, it's quite significant and it's quite huge, Chris. I mean, just talking about what the supply constraints are, you know, the deficit, we are talking about 6,000 megawatts of power that need to come onto the system in order to avert load shedding. And the program that I mentioned, the risk mitigation IPP program, only covers 2,000 megawatts. So we really need another program that will complement that program in order to close those deficits so that we don't experience load shedding going forward. We need round 5 of the renewable IPP program to come out. The IPP officers come on record and said, look, we believe the request for proposals might come out in next year, well, next year around Q2, and we are hoping that that is the case to ensure that load shedding is averted going forward. So the market and the needs are quite dire, and we really need to start closing the gaps. The self-generation aspect of it, distributed generation, as we've mentioned, myself and Mphokolo have emphasized that. Say you don't need government to come in and put its money on the table, put government guarantees. That is quite important in terms of closing the gap. the industry has said, look, we are ready to buy our own power from independent power producers. So let's ensure that all of that does happen in the next couple of months. We need those 55 projects that Mphokolo has mentioned, the 6 projects, strategic integrated projects that have been gazetted recently, to be implemented in the next couple of months.
That's encouraging news. And also, perhaps I look for a bit more encouragement from you, Mphokolo. You mentioned that there's stimulus packages around, people always talking pension funds, institutions in Europe and the United States who are looking to invest in emerging markets like South Africa. Just give me a little bit of hope. What kind of inquiries are you getting, and from what kind of organizations at RMB right now?
So Chris, I think taking it closer to home, just to make it a lot more tangible. I mean, the PIC has been very active, which is the state's pension fund manager in the renewables program. We've seen them literally move, emphasizes their need and desire to participate meaningfully and actively in the infrastructure sector. More from international capital that's looking for a home. We've received inquiries mainly from the United States, because I think there is a history there of pension funds and state pension funds actually investing in infrastructure. What they've actually done is organize themselves into a consortium such that collectively, at least coming into a new market being either South Africa or Africa as a whole, it that they have facilitates focused conversations and discussions to make sure that where capital can be placed, the need to fast track project development is actually increased to make sure that this capital is actually deployed. From a European perspective, we've seen more along the likes of, I guess, your DFIs, your KFWs, your European Investment Bank, who've also been pretty active in the sector. We've recently seen as well NIGA come into the market.
Sorry, struggling a bit with Mphokolo's connection there, but we're not struggling with you, Mpho. Let's continue. What kind of trade-offs do you think South Africa needs in order to move towards getting back into positive GDP again and attracting investment?
So, Chris, I mean, we're talking about bolstering our project preparation efforts even more. I can't emphasize that more. So we really need to get projects to bankability, to a stage where they can attract the capital that is available out there. There is no shortage of money in the market, and that has been said time and time and again. To what Mphokolo was saying, your multilateral development finance institutions are saying, we are ready to fund projects, we are ready to deploy capital. Now, where are the projects that we can lend into? The SIDS methodology really covers that in terms of saying, look, we are aware that a lot of the projects get stuck on the regulatory side in terms of clearing them through the system in order to get them to bankability so that you as bankers can start funding them. So we've put together what we call Infrastructure South Africa. So that initiative, that office is really meant to help the private sector, the public sector, municipalities in order to fast track the development of projects. And I'm quite excited about that initiative, Infrastructure South Africa, headed up by Dr. Ramokgopa. In my view, is going to work quite well to ensure that it changes the number of infrastructure projects that are coming online, coming through the system. We're already seeing short-term opportunities on the basis of the gazetted projects. The other project that I should mention, Chris, is the small IPP renewable energy program. That is quite an important initiative in that it's really meant to transform. It's really meant to transform and ensure that there's a Black participation in the renewable energy sector. You know, such that we don't be talking about BEE codes in the renewable energy sector in the next couple of years.
Mphokolo, just one last question to you here. I mean, after all the pain and deprivation the economy of South Africa's been through in the last 6 months of COVID, one thing people always gives me a little bit of hope. People say, well, we can rewrite the rules, we can change things, we can start afresh when everyone gets back to normal. What do you think is going to come out of that in the renewable energy investment space?
So, Chris, there's nothing as good as a crisis to focus people's minds, right? Because everybody has felt the pain and sees the dire need to actually move forward. So Mpho has actually also mentioned the risk mitigation program, which, to be honest, I mean, my personal opinion, and I must be very careful how I phrase this, is that if you look at those requirements of that program, it says it requires energy that's able to come onto the grid very quickly, within 10 seconds to 10 minutes. And it also should be able to run during peak time. Now, for me, this is an opportunity to say the long overdue gas to power program, as well as the gas industrialization program in the country. This is an opportunity to actually kickstart that by using this program as a test case, so to speak, right? We've also seen the request for bids coming from Eskom, which has been driven by the African Development Bank and the New Development Bank, just to drive the point home about what Mpho was saying about multilateral organizations. Now that talks to energy storage. So there's so many, there are two projects particularly, which are also driving the advancement of energy in the country in terms of introducing storage into electricity, as well as increasing increasing the participation of gas in the sector, as well as opening up the industrialization of gas as a country in South Africa. Coupled with that, we've seen the ROMCO transaction coming onto the market from a Sasol perspective, which in itself was actually designed at inception to open up the gas industry for the Southern African corridor. So these two programs for me are also a good way to dovetail into other sectors of the economy to open up infrastructure development, not just in power, but also in the industrialization for the country as well.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Mphokolo Makara, the Transactor Infrastructure Finance at RMB, and Mpho Mokwele, the Head of Project Finance at the DBSA. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.